Hey, I'm Hamish and this is Writing on Games. When I made my last video on Thumper, one thought went through my head the entire time. Between the abstracted visuals and unsettling atmosphere, the small team wrestling their way out of a constrictive corporate structure to pursue a purer vision of music, as well as said team's experience in pushing boundaries in other media, that game is punk as hell. But what does that sentiment actually mean? Punk is seemingly one of those words that when someone says it, you know exactly what they're getting at, and yet it's difficult to quantify. Partly this is because it's not a specific genre applied to a specific medium. We perhaps most commonly associate it with aggressive music, but it has roots in all aspects of culture, from films to books, visual art to fashion. And even then, it's more than just the content of a piece of art, but how the context of its production affects said content. Who made it? Who funded it, if there was any funding to begin with? What was the impulse that drove its creation? More often than not, that impulse, as I see it, is one of disruption, of confronting the way media is typically produced. It's about realizing that if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself, then proving to everyone that you can do it yourself, regardless of wealth, resources, or even technical ability in a lot of cases, coming up with creative workarounds to whatever problems might arise from these issues. In doing so, you create something that might not be perfect or polished, but something more important for the humanity or new perspective it might bring to the table. In this regard, however, games find themselves in a weird spot. They're maybe the most complicated art form of all. On some level, anyone can strum a guitar or hammer on a keyboard and get a sound out of it. Most people can write words on a page. In order to get the most basic software functioning, however, it takes a certain degree of technical know-how. Games incorporate visual art, music, literature, as well as their own artistic language, and so usually require teams of specialists in each field. As such, perhaps more so than music, games often find themselves placed firmly within a corporate culture, where production costs are inevitably higher and profits matter even more. And given its inherently technical nature, we often view the success of a piece of software as its ease of use and functionality, when the very nature of punk suggests some kind of lo-fi abrasiveness, of removing people from their comfort zones to get them examining the context of a piece of art more closely. The production framework is different for games, so where does the confrontation lie? What makes a game punk? Well, to begin exploring this, we can examine the works actively posited as such. Take for instance the games of Suda51, a man lauded by many, including himself, to be the punk of the industry as we currently know it. As he would explain it, making punk video games seemingly amounts to thinking outside the box. As his early work shows, however, this isn't merely a catchy slogan. Embracing the borderline postmodern deconstruction of meaning, some would argue, lies at the heart of punk as an attitude. Killer 7, for example, is a game I rushed out to buy having seen it advertised as some kind of frenetic, fast-paced shooter, only to stick it in my PS2 and find a comparatively slow adventure game, where its arguably clunky combat became a strange puzzle of prioritizing slow-moving targets before sniping their weak points, all with an utterly incomprehensible narrative. It's far from perfect, but there's also absolutely nothing like it. It's greater than the sum of its parts, and as a result, also remains one of my favourite games ever made. It all stems from Suda's team actively breaking down what he called standardised control schemes in things like camera and movement, and building them back up to something that bore surface level similarities to other styles, yet was utterly unique in its execution. For example, instead of running and shooting freely like you would in most games of this style, here movement is on rails and shooting can only happen when you stand still. At first it might feel jarring and restrictive, but then you realise the layer of tension added to combat scenarios as the heaven smiles march creepily towards you. Is it an adventure game, puzzle, horror, comedy? You could make a valid argument for any one of them. We typically categorise games based on their systems, camera perspective, etc. It's something we know, something we're comfortable with. Suda and his team clearly wanted to disrupt that on a mechanical level. But it's not just mechanics either. With its near nonsensical plot, some might say Killer 7 is style over substance, but even in that, one can link it to Punk's more deconstructionist sensibilities. It takes disparate chunks of anime, wrestling, Saturday morning cartoons, slasher horror, 50s greasers, etc., inelegantly slams it all together and bombards you with it to such an extent as to make it genuinely artful, to get you pontificating over meaning, trying to find the through line of this style as if it were high art, when its constituent parts are generally deemed as lowly. It's similar to what writer Elizabeth Wilson described in Punk fashion as trash culture gone avant-garde. Like Punk's slapdash look, constructed from whatever fabric one could find, acted as a message to the fashion world's elitism, Killer 7's trashy style could have been a response to anything. The gritty, serious tone you were starting to see emerge in games releasing at the time. The absurdity inherent to playing video games. The idea that you couldn't just slam all this stuff together purely because you liked it. In a way, Killer 7 pokes fun at everything around it merely by existing. And you could say the same thing about the way the Silver Case's text adventure would sometimes cut to anime or full motion video seemingly out of the blue. Maybe Suda just likes this stuff, and in an industry where things need to be streamlined in order to maximize efficiency, this approach is confrontational in and of itself. That game was produced when Grasshopper was staffed by 5 people, its unique windowed style a direct result of limited resources and having team members fulfill multiple roles. To paraphrase Penny Rimbaud of the band Crass, a bunch of people saying what they wanted with whatever they could find. Far from the GarageBand-esque roots of the Silver Case, however, Killer 7 was published by none other than Capcom as part of the infamous Capcom 5, a venture between themselves and Nintendo to champion third-party support for the then-failing GameCube. The fact that, in this case, 2 giant companies took a chance on a small developer to ostensibly boost sales of a console, only for said developer to produce something so aggressively weird within this corporate framework, only serves to highlight how defiant a game Killer 7 is. Furthermore, Suda suggests that there was something inherently punk about Japanese games in particular, proclaiming them the progenitors of a lot of the concepts we see in games worldwide today. He doesn't specify what exactly made Japanese games punk outside of that, but when you consider the canon of industry auteurs, your Hideo Kojimas, Yoko Taros and the like, it's a statement that begins to make a bit more sense. These people also make games within larger corporate structures. Their budgets are big, but arguably revolutionized, even in some small way, the way games tell their stories. Whether it be through careful cinematography or exploring player culpability through something as trivial as the way the game handles save data. These are often aggressive statements on the nature of player control, taking you out of your comfort zone in the same way all punk or experimental media strives to. In all, some might say that while punk in other art forms may have proved to be accidental or a matter of necessity or circumstance, in games, thanks to their more expensive and complex nature, a developer has to more deliberately examine standards of control and style, the way other games look and feel, and use that knowledge to subvert players' expectations. And despite Suda's work post-Killer 7 in particular losing that defiant magic due to an abundance of functional but disappointingly standard hack and slashers, it's clear that just because games have higher costs with a higher drive for profit doesn't stop them from occupying the same disruptive space as punk works found in other art forms. But that's clearly not where this discussion ends. Outside of Japan, the obvious answer to the question, what makes a game punk, would be the indie games scene that, while always present in some form or another, has exploded in the last decade or so, with developers finding the means to build their own studios, and in some cases make some money doing it. As I stated before, one of the key goals of punk as I see it is proving that you can do it yourself in direct opposition to people or a system telling you can't. So who was it then who empowered these developers to pursue their own development goals? Who democratized the tools? Who proved that you could? Well, to find out more, we'd have to go further back. Take something like Doom, one time referred to as gaming's punk rock moment. Now, when you think of what got people talking about that game, you might imagine its time as the poster child of controversy and moral panic within the video game industry. When I think of what makes Doom punk, however, I don't necessarily picture the bombast of its violence or its bestial satanic imagery, which, as controversial as they originally were, read as little more than goofy fun now. No, it's the disruptive attitude behind its development. Indeed, as the press release penned by the then 4-person team at id Software prior to a single line of code being written proclaiming that it would be the best game ever would seem to suggest, there's a distinctly punk swagger to the game's production. They decided to release the game as a shareware title, encouraging people to copy it and share it freely. They made the bold move of allowing stores to sell their own boxed copies of the game without needing to pay a cut to the team in an attempt to get people talking about it. They released the files to the public, allowing for the first real modding community and kickstarting the careers of several developers. It was a true democratization of the process, the same kind of camaraderie you see in all DIY punk communities, where creators and audience are on more of an equal playing field, handling their own packaging, distribution and promotion through posters and zines, bootlegging recordings and the like, all for the sake of having people experience something they may not get through traditional media channels, financial incentives be damned. And given that at one point more people had Doom installed on their computers than they did Windows 95, the message was clear: if us four can do it, so can you, and here's everything you need. And that's about as typically punk an outlook as you can get. But for me, the idea of video games as punk goes back even further than that. It's less typical than that, coming not from in-your-face bravado and wailing guitars. Instead, maybe it's a desolate geometric hellscape, maybe it's repetitive, incessant beeping. Indeed, the advent of British home development in the 80s was characterised by games that are, by modern standards, rudimentary and often inscrutable. They often saw you repeating mundane tasks like mowing the lawn or tidying up after a party so you could get past your mum, but in order to do so would have you navigating these surreal, stark black and grey environments littered with downright Freudian imagery of your mother and the church and household objects floating around this indeterminate space seemingly at random but all coming to kill you, all topped off with that specifically British self-deprecatory humour. What's that? You got viciously devoured by a bunch of ants? Well, better go back in and do better. It's not like there's anything else to do here. There's something positively bleak about it all. And it perhaps makes things difficult reading these games from a modern context, not to view them as some kind of satirical representation of the cultural malaise felt by teenagers trying to both escape from and make the best of it in Thatcher's grey industrial Britain, dealing with the same crisis of identity you were starting to see in the weirder, more insular lyrics of the anarcho-punk bands of the time like Rudimentary Peni, framing the system they were angrily fighting against as some kind of unknowable Lovecraftian beast, trying and failing to stave off mental anguish and apathy. But in reality, the disruptive impetus behind these games and their developers was probably far more simple and even optimistic. With the release of home computers such as the ZX Spectrum and the Electron, companies like Sinclair and Acorn had shifted the image of the computer from something purely technical, industrial, and inaccessible to a tool for creation and play by lowering the cost of admission and giving aspiring developers what was, at the time, a comparatively high amount of memory to work with. Through this accessibility, there was no boundary or limit other than the imaginations of this new groundswell of bedroom developers. Reading stories of this style of development, a common theme you'll find is physicality. People had to get their hands dirty, almost literally building these games. There was a struggle, a lack of automated tools to get them through it. Sandy White, developer of Ant-Attack, speaks of a heightened focus on electronics rather than programming, of wires and written mathematics over assemblers and compilers you'd find in later programming environments. Matthew Smith, one of the legends of the early British software scene with his games Jet Set Willy and Manic Miner, talks about the resourcefulness required of people due to system limitations and the fear of burning images into CRT screens at the time. You either set it underground where it was black, or up in space where it was black. And it's here we see the notion of a few dweebs starting a band with whatever they could find being directly paralleled with the lone programmer soldering circuitry and learning the ins and outs of the hardware as they went along. And while sophisticated for the time, many of these games were clunky and, shall we say, heavily influenced by what came before. But that's what's great about them. The context of their production imbues the games with humour and charm that goes beyond what you're actually interacting with. All in, it's this style of development that proved that you didn't need a massive studio or wads of cash in order to create something meaningful that resonated with people. And if that doesn't fit some weird, arbitrary definition of whatever punk is, I guess, then I don't know what does. So I hope you enjoyed my piece examining punk in video games. It's impossible to cover everything in a format like this, and I apologise for inevitably missing stuff out, but feel free to discuss what you think makes a game punk in the comments. As always, these videos are made possible by your unbelievably generous support over on Patreon. So if you want to see more of this kind of larger scale video, maybe consider donating. Every pledge helps more than you can possibly know. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Nico Bleackley, Rob, Michael Wolf, Artyom Vitsyuk, Spike Jones, The Nameless Guy, Chris Wright, Dr. Motorcycle, Harry Fuertes, Ham Migas, Travis Bennett, Zach Casserly, Samuel Pickens, Tom Nash, Shardfire, Philip Lange, Anna Pimentel, Jesse Ryan, Brandon Robinson, Justin's Holderness, Biggie Smith, Peter, Christian Kuhneman, Camel Traffic, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, I've been Hamish, and this has been Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.